The leather of James Carson's boots cracked against the sun-baked earth as he stood before his father's headstone. 38 years old, with calloused hands and grief lines etched into his face, James had returned to a place he'd sworn never to set foot on again. Westridge Ranch, 6,000 acres of drought-scarred Montana soil, had been his birthright, his prison, and now, unexpectedly, his inheritance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The harsh summer wind carried dust across the small cemetery where 4 generations of Carsons rested beneath modest markers. James adjusted his worn Stetson, shielding eyes that hadn't shed tears since he was 17. His father, Richard Carson, a man as unyielding as the land he'd worked for 50 years, had died alone during the worst drought in county history, leaving behind a struggling ranch, a mountain of debt, and secrets buried deeper than any well could reach. "You ready to head back to the house?" Sheriff Mike Donnelly asked, his patrol truck idling nearby. A childhood friend who'd become the law in Rivercrest Valley, Mike had been the one to call James with news of his father's heart attack 3 days earlier. "Guess I don't have much choice," James replied, his voice rough from disuse. The 2-hour funeral service had drawn barely 15 people, a testament to how his father had systematically alienated everyone in the valley over the decades. "Still can't believe he left it all to me." Mike snorted. Richard Carson never did anything without a reason. Even dying. The 10-mile drive from the cemetery to Westridge Ranch stretched through a landscape James had once known better than his own reflection. Wheat fields lay dormant and cracked, casualties of 3 consecutive years of drought that had bankrupted half the farms in the county. Irrigation pipes stood abandoned like the skeletons of giant serpents that had died of thirst. "Valley's dying," James observed, breaking the heavy silence. Mike kept his eyes on the dirt road. "Been tough since the river started drying up. Your dad was the last holdout. Refused every offer from Meridian Agricultural. Even when they went up to $12 million for the water rights alone." James's head snapped toward him. $12 million? That's impossible. The whole operation isn't worth half that. Not the land, Mike clarified. The water rights. Meridian's bought up 90% of the valley over the last 5 years. Your dad was sitting on the last major underground aquifer that hasn't been tapped. The truck crested the final hill, revealing Westridge Ranch in its faded glory. The 2-story farmhouse stood weathered but proud against the backdrop of distant mountains, its white paint peeling and gray with age. 3 barns, various outbuildings, and miles of fence line extended across the property. A place that had once supported 50 workers now seemed abandoned, with only a few cattle visible in the distance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, James noticed a black SUV parked near the house. A tall woman in an expensive suit stood on the porch, checking her watch. "That's Catherine Voss," Mike said with undisguised contempt. "Meridian's regional director. Vulture didn't even wait until your father was in the ground." James felt something harden inside him, a familiar anger he'd carried since leaving this place 20 years ago at 18. "Wait here." He approached the woman with deliberate steps, dust rising with each footfall. Up close, Catherine Voss looked like she'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom, designer clothes, perfect makeup, and a smile that never reached her calculating eyes. "Mr. Carson," she extended a manicured hand. "My deepest condolences for your loss." James ignored the outstretched hand. "You're trespassing." Her smile didn't falter. "I had an appointment with your father for today. Obviously, circumstances have changed, but our offer hasn't. Meridian Agricultural is prepared to pay $13.5 million for Westridge Ranch. No contingencies, no waiting. You could be back in," she paused, looking him over, "wherever you've been living by tomorrow night. My father's been dead for 3 days. And the drought won't pause for sentiment, Mr. Carson. This valley is dying. The aquifer beneath this property could save thousands of jobs if properly managed by people who understand modern agriculture. James felt his jaw tighten. "Get off my land." Something flashed across her face, frustration, perhaps, or surprise at being dismissed. "Here's my card. Our offer expires in 2 weeks." She placed it on the porch railing. Most people would consider $13 million a generous price for a failing ranch with outdated equipment and no profit margin. As she walked to her SUV, James called after her. "If the ranch is worthless, why the hell are you offering $13 million? Catherine Voss turned, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal something predatory underneath. "Progress requires resources, Mr. Carson. The future of this valley doesn't include family farms or ranches. It's nothing personal." She slid into her vehicle and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that drifted across the yard like a ghost. Mike joined him on the porch. "She's been hounding your father for months. Called weekly, sent letters, even tried coming through the back gate once." James stared at the business card but didn't touch it. "Dad would rather have died than sell this place." "Well," Mike said quietly, "he did." The house smelled of dust and solitude when James pushed open the door. Nothing had changed in the 2 decades since he'd left, the same worn furniture, the same faded photographs lining the hallway, the same rifle mounted above the stone fireplace. Only the layer of neglect was new, evidence of his father's declining health and isolation. In the kitchen, dirty dishes still sat in the sink. A half-finished cup of coffee had evaporated, leaving a dark ring at the bottom. James opened the refrigerator to find it nearly empty except for condiments, a few beers, and milk that had long since spoiled. "Your dad wasn't taking care of himself toward the end," Mike observed from the doorway. "Doc Simmons tried to check on him, but you know how stubborn Richard was." James moved through the house like a stranger, touching surfaces, opening drawers. In his father's study, papers were scattered across an ancient oak desk, bank statements, foreclosure notices, and letters from Meridian Agricultural offering increasingly larger sums for the property. "He was broke," James said, examining a final notice from the bank. "How could he turn down that kind of money if he was 3 months from foreclosure?" Mike leaned against the doorframe. "That's the million-dollar question. Or $13 million question, I guess." James sat heavily in his father's chair, the leather creaking beneath him. "You know what the last thing he said to me was? 20 years ago, when I told him I was leaving?" He didn't wait for Mike to answer. "This land is Carson land. It'll be here when you're ready to be a man." Sounds like Richard. "I never planned to come back. Yet here you are." The sun was setting when Mike finally left, promising to return tomorrow with the lawyer who held his father's will. James stood on the porch watching the patrol car disappear down the long driveway, feeling the weight of the land pressing against him from all sides, a familiar sensation he'd spent 2 decades trying to escape. Inside, he found a half-empty bottle of whiskey in a kitchen cabinet and poured himself 3 fingers. The house settled around him with creaks and groans as night descended, bringing with it a chill that penetrated the old walls. He wandered through rooms filled with memories, some good, most painful, arguments about college, about the future of the ranch, about James's mother who had died when he was 12. In his father's bedroom, the bedsheets were still rumpled, a book lay open on the nightstand. James picked it up, a worn copy of Steinbeck's East of Eden, a story about fathers and sons and the legacy of land. A strange choice for a man who had never shown any interest in literature. As he flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper fell out. James opened it to find a handwritten note in his father's distinctive script. "James, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things about this land you need to know. Things I should have told you years ago. The cellar holds what you need to understand. The combination is your birth date. Don't trust Meridian. Don't sell, no matter what. This land has secrets worth more than money." Dad James read the note 3 times, trying to make sense of it. His father had never been one for cryptic messages or dramatic gestures. The cellar he mentioned could only be the old root cellar behind the house, a place James had been forbidden to enter as a child, under threat of the belt. Outside, the moon cast long shadows across the yard as James made his way to the small, unassuming structure built into the side of a hill. A heavy padlock secured a steel door that looked newer than the surrounding stonework. James entered his birthdate, 0-4-1-5-8-7, into the combination lock with shaking fingers. The mechanism clicked, and the padlock fell open. The hinges protested as James pulled the door, releasing the smell of earth and something else, something chemical and unfamiliar. He reached for the light switch he remembered from childhood, but nothing happened. Using his phone's flashlight, he descended worn stone steps into darkness. At the bottom, his light revealed not the root cellar he vaguely remembered, but something entirely different. The small space he recalled had been expanded into a cavernous underground room, its walls reinforced with concrete and metal. Industrial shelving lined every wall, stacked with supplies, canned food, water purifiers, first aid kits, and what appeared to be scientific equipment. In the center stood a massive table covered with maps, geological surveys, and documents bearing government seals. James approached slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The largest map showed Westridge Ranch in the surrounding valley, with detailed markings of underground water sources, wells, and what appeared to be a vast network extending far beneath the surface. One document caught his eye, a faded report dated 1962 with classified stamped across its cover. James opened it with trembling hands and began to read. As the words registered, he felt his knees weaken. "Jesus Christ," he whispered into the empty room. The report detailed the discovery and subsequent classification of what lay beneath Westridge Ranch, not merely a water aquifer, but something the government had spent 60 years hiding from the public. Something that explained why Meridian Agricultural was willing to pay $13 million for seemingly worthless land. James sank into a chair, document in hand, as the truth about his inheritance crashed over him like a wave. Everything he thought he knew about his father, about the ranch, about why he'd been forced to learn every inch of this property as a child, it all shifted into focus with terrible clarity. What Richard Carson had protected until his dying breath wasn't just land or water rights. It was something that could transform the entire valley, something that explained the decades of government inspections disguised as agricultural surveys, the strange visitors in his childhood, and his father's pathological secrecy. The sound of tires on gravel outside yanked James from his shock. Headlights swept across the cellar's small windows near the ceiling. He quickly gathered the most important documents, shoved them into his jacket, and climbed the stairs. As he secured the padlock, a car door slammed. Catherine Voss stood in the moonlight, two men in dark suits flanking her. Their posture and vigilant eyes marked them as security rather than executives. "Mr. Carson," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "I apologize for the late visit, but I believe we have more to discuss. Particularly about what's under your father's property." James stepped away from the cellar door, heart pounding. "I told you to leave." "I'm afraid this is bigger than your grief or your family history," she replied, walking toward him with confident steps. "We know what's down there. We know what your father was hiding. And trust me when I say this isn't something you want to handle alone." Behind her, the men spread out slightly, hands near their jackets. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to carry the weight of his father's warning, "Don't trust Meridian. Don't sell, no matter what." James straightened his back, feeling the documents press against his chest inside his jacket. For the first time since returning to Westridge Ranch, he knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't leaving, not now, maybe not ever. "Whatever's under this land," he said evenly, "is Carson land. And it'll stay that way." Catherine's smile vanished. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Mr. Carson." "No," James agreed, thinking of the classified report and what it revealed about the true value of his inheritance. "But I'm starting to figure it out." As they faced each other in the moonlight, with the secret cellar at his back and his father's legacy finally coming into focus, James realized that the most valuable things at Westridge Ranch had always been hidden from view, buried beneath the surface, waiting for someone worthy to discover them. And now, like the valley itself, everything was about to change. Catherine's security men flanked her like shadows as the standoff continued in the moonlight. James kept his hand on the cellar door, positioning himself between them and his father's secrets. "You need to leave now," James said, voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. "Let me be clear about something, Mr. Carson." Catherine stepped forward, moonlight catching the sharp angles of her face. "What's beneath this property isn't just water. We both know that. What you don't know is that your father signed preliminary agreements with us before his death." James felt his jaw tighten. "Show me." "The paperwork is being processed. But we had a verbal agreement. My father wouldn't sell this place if you put a gun to his head," James cut in. Catherine's professional smile returned, thin and dangerous. People change their minds when faced with financial ruin. The bank was 3 weeks from foreclosure. And heart conditions make people reconsider their priorities. The implication hung in the air between them. James took a step forward, close enough to see the flecks of amber in her calculating eyes. "Are you suggesting Meridian had something to do with my father's death?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. Catherine didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting your father was a practical man in the end. And that you should be too." She glanced meaningfully at the men beside her. $13 million is our final offer. Think about what you could do with that kind of money instead of clinging to a dying ranch out of misplaced sentimentality. "Get off my property," James said, each word precise and cold. "Next time, bring those supposed agreements or don't come at all." Something dangerous flickered in Catherine's eyes. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Carson." "Soon." James watched their headlights disappear down the long drive, then quickly returned to the house, documents clutched inside his jacket. In the kitchen, he spread them across the table, geological surveys, government reports, and maps that revealed what Richard Carson had been protecting all these years. The classified report detailed the discovery in 1962 of what geologists had initially believed was a massive underground aquifer. Further investigation revealed something far more valuable, a massive deposit of rare earth minerals essential for advanced electronics, renewable energy systems, and military applications. Minerals that had become increasingly critical as technology evolved and global supplies dwindled. The government had classified the discovery, compensated the Carson family handsomely for their silence, and maintained secret monitoring of the site for decades. The agreement granted the family continued ownership with the understanding that the land would never be sold or developed without government approval. In exchange, the Carsons received substantial annual payments, explaining how the ranch had survived previous droughts and economic downturns when others failed. Another document, dated just 3 years ago, showed how the classification had been quietly lifted during a departmental reorganization. Somehow, Meridian Agricultural had discovered the secret, and recognized that what lay beneath Westridge Ranch was potentially worth billions, not millions. James ran his fingers through his hair, mind racing. This explained everything: his father's obsession with keeping the land, his insistence that James learn every inch of the property, the mysterious government agricultural experts who visited throughout his childhood. The sound of his phone ringing startled him. Sheriff Mike Donnelly's name flashed on the screen. "James, you all right out there?" Mike's voice carried a note of concern. "Yeah, why?" "Just got a call from Hal Peterson over at the north boundary. Says he saw vehicles headed toward the ranch. Thought I should check since it's nearly midnight." James glanced out the window toward the now empty driveway. "Meridian's director paid me a visit. She's gone now." A pause. "At this hour? That's not good." "Listen, James, there's something else. Your father came to see me about 3 weeks ago. Said if anything happened to him, I should tell you to check the safe deposit box at First National. Box 227. Said you'd know the combination." James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Did he think something was going to happen to him? He seemed worried. Not like himself. Kept looking over his shoulder. Mike hesitated. "The official cause was heart failure, but what? The timing's convenient for some people, that's all I'm saying." After hanging up, James returned to the documents. Among them was a leather journal, his father's handwriting filling pages with observations about soil samples, water tests, and visitor logs stretching back decades. The most recent entries detailed Meridian's increasing pressure tactics and veiled threats. The final entry, dated just 5 days before his death, read, "Voss came again today. Offered $15 million this time. When I refused, she mentioned how isolated the ranch is, how accidents happen to men my age." Not a direct threat, but the intention was clear. Move the core samples to the bank. If anything happens, James needs to know the truth. This land isn't just our legacy, it's our responsibility. Sleep evaded James that night. He sat on the porch until dawn, watching the land emerge from darkness, the rolling pastures, the distant mountains, the abandoned equipment that stood as monuments to his family's century of working the soil. For the first time since returning, he felt something shift inside him, a connection to this place that transcended his complicated relationship with his father. As the first light broke over the eastern hills, James made a decision. He showered, changed into fresh clothes from his suitcase, and drove into town. Rivercrest hadn't changed much in 20 years, still a single main street with the essential businesses that served the surrounding farms and ranches. Many storefronts stood empty now, casualties of the drought and changing economy. The First National Bank occupied the same brick building where James had opened his first savings account at 10 years old. Margaret Winters, now in her 60s but with the same immaculate blonde hair James remembered from his childhood, recognized him immediately. "James Carson," she said, her professional demeanor warming. "Welcome home. I was at the service yesterday, though I don't think you saw me." "It's been a long few days," James admitted. After verifying his identity, Margaret led him to the safe deposit vault. Box 227 required 2 keys, the bank's and the customer's. When James explained he didn't have his father's key, Margaret checked the records. "Your father arranged for you to access this box with the same combination as something else. He said you'd know what that meant." James entered his birthdate into the electronic pad. The lock clicked open. Inside the box lay several items: a sealed envelope with James's name, a USB drive, a small box containing what appeared to be rock samples, and a weathered leather pouch. James opened the envelope first. "James, if you're reading this, I'm either dead or incapacitated. For 50 years, I've protected what lies beneath our land, not just for our family, but for reasons you'll understand once you see what's on the drive. Meridian discovered the truth about 2 years ago through a former government employee. They're not after water rights, they want what's below the aquifer. The mineral deposits extend beyond our property line, but the only viable access point is through the southwestern section of our land, the old creek bed where I taught you to fish. The samples in the box are from core drillings I've taken over the years. The government doesn't know I kept these. I've made enemies protecting this land, son. If my death seems convenient for certain interests, it probably wasn't natural. The pouch contains your grandfather's revolver. I hope you never need it, but Carson men have always understood that some things are worth dying for. I know we parted badly. I couldn't tell you the truth then, the agreement prohibited it. I hope someday you'll understand that everything I did was to prepare you for this responsibility. This land isn't just dirt and grass, it's a trust we've kept for generations." Dad James sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. He'd spent 20 years believing his father's strictness, his unyielding expectations, had been about preserving outdated traditions and controlling his son's life. Now, the weight of what Richard Carson had been carrying, alone, settled on James's shoulders. After securing the items in his jacket, James thanked Margaret and left. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he spotted Mike Donnelly across the street, deep in conversation with a man James didn't recognize. When Mike saw him, he quickly ended the discussion and crossed over. "Got the lawyer meeting us at the ranch at noon," Mike said, falling into step beside him. "Did you find what you needed?" James nodded, not trusting himself to speak about the letter's contents in public. "Who are you talking to?" Mike's expression darkened. "Thomas Reeves. EPA official, supposedly here about drought management. Been asking questions about your father for the past week. Claims it's routine. Nothing about this is routine, James muttered. As they reached James's truck, a familiar black SUV rolled slowly down Main Street. Catherine Voss sat in the passenger seat, her gaze locking with James's as they passed. She didn't wave or acknowledge him, just watched with calculated interest. Back at the ranch, James and Mike sat at the kitchen table examining the contents from the safe deposit box. The USB drive contained hundreds of files, geological surveys, correspondence with government officials, and detailed maps of the mineral deposits. The rock samples were carefully labeled with dates and GPS coordinates. These minerals, Mike said, reading from one report, are critical for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. Current global supplies are controlled by China and a few other countries. A domestic source this size would be worth billions, James finished. And Meridian knows it. That explains why they've bought nearly every property in the valley. They're positioning themselves for extraction rights. The sound of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Walter Griffin, the family lawyer who had handled Carson affairs for 3 decades. The elderly attorney moved slowly, his weathered face a map of concern as he shook James's hand. Richard was more than a client, Walter said as they settled in the study. I want you to know that. The will itself was straightforward, Westridge Ranch and all assets transferred to James Ethan Carson, sole heir and beneficiary. What followed was more surprising. Your father amended this document 4 times in the last year, Walter explained, adjusting his glasses. He added extensive restrictions on any future sale of the property. The land cannot be sold without approval from a trust he established, which requires unanimous consent from 3 trustees, yourself, myself, and Dr. Eleanor Carson. James blinked. Who? Walter looked up, confusion crossing his face. Your father's sister. Your aunt. My father was an only child, James said flatly. Mike and Walter exchanged glances. That's not accurate, Walter said carefully. Eleanor Carson is a geologist with the United States Geological Survey. She and your father had a falling out many years ago, before you were born. I assumed you knew of her existence, even if you hadn't met. James felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. My father never mentioned having a sister. Not once in 38 years. Walter removed another document from his briefcase. This is her contact information. According to the will, she must be notified immediately of Richard's death and the inheritance provisions. James took the paper numbly, staring at the name in Washington, D.C., address of a woman who supposedly shared his blood but whom he'd never known existed. Another of his father's secrets, buried like everything else that didn't fit the narrative of Westridge Ranch. There's more, Walter continued. The will contains a sealed addendum that can only be opened when all 3 trustees are present. Richard was very specific about this condition. After Walter left, James sat in stunned silence, trying to process the cascade of revelations. Mike poured them both whiskey, the amber liquid catching afternoon light through the study windows. Did you know? James finally asked. About my aunt? Mike shook his head. Your dad never mentioned her. But it explains some things. Like what? The government connections. The geological expertise. Mike hesitated. The woman who used to visit when we were kids, tall, red hair, always came in a government vehicle. I assumed she was from the Department of Agriculture. James had no memory of such a visitor, but then, there were many gaps in his childhood recollections, periods when his father would send him to stay with neighbors during business meetings at the ranch. After Mike left, James called the number Walter had provided. It went to voicemail. He left a brief message explaining who he was and why he was calling, then hung up, feeling strangely hollow. The afternoon stretched into evening. James walked the property, seeing it through new eyes, not just as the ranch he'd fled, but as land concealing secrets worth killing for. His father's warnings about Meridian took on new urgency with each passing hour. As sunset painted the western sky in fierce oranges and reds, James returned to the cellar. He methodically examined every document, every map, trying to understand the full scope of what his family had been guarding for generations. Among the files, he found personnel records for ranch hands dating back decades, men his father had hired, not for their agricultural skills, but for their military backgrounds and ability to maintain security without raising suspicions. The sound of an approaching vehicle pulled him from his research. Expecting Mike's return, he was surprised to see an unfamiliar truck coming up the drive, an older model Ford with government plates. James quickly secured the cellar, locked the door, and walked toward the house, one hand near the revolver now tucked into his waistband. The truck stopped, and a woman stepped out, tall, with silver-streaked red hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore khaki pants, hiking boots, and a denim jacket over a plain white shirt. Despite being in her 60s, she moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to fieldwork. Her eyes, the same deep blue as his father's, as his own, scanned the property before settling on James. "You must be my nephew," she said, her voice carrying a slight huskiness. "I'm Eleanor Carson." James stood motionless, studying the woman who was supposedly his aunt, searching for resemblances, for truth, for explanations. "How did you get here so fast?" he asked. "I just left you a message a few hours ago." "I was already on my way when you called," Eleanor replied. "The moment Richard's death hit the USGS internal bulletin, I knew there would be trouble." She glanced toward the cellar. "Has anyone from Meridian contacted you yet?" "Catherine Voss." "Twice." Eleanor's expression hardened. "I was afraid of that." "We need to talk, James. There are things about this land, about our family, that you need to understand." Inside the house, Eleanor moved with surprising familiarity, navigating directly to the kitchen where she filled the kettle without having to search for it. James watched, unsettled by this stranger who seemed to know her way around his childhood home. "When was the last time you were here?" he asked. 3 years ago. Richard and I maintained limited contact over the decades." She measured tea into 2 mugs. "Enough to coordinate on essential matters." "Essential matters meaning what's underground?" Eleanor's gaze was evaluating, measuring him. "So he told you before he died?" "I found his records." "In the cellar?" She nodded, seemingly relieved. "That simplifies things." The kettle whistled, and she poured water with practiced movements. "What did Voss offer you for the ranch?" $13 million. Then hinted at 15. A short, humorless laugh escaped her. "Pennies on the dollar for what's actually there." "Which is what, exactly?" "The reports mention rare earth minerals, but it's not just any deposit," Eleanor interrupted, sliding a mug toward him. "It's the largest concentrated source of dysprosium, neodymium, and terbium ever discovered on American soil. Essential components for everything from wind turbines to precision weapons. Currently, China controls over 85% of global production." She took a sip of tea. "What's under this ranch could shift the global balance of strategic resources for the next century. And the government just let our family keep it. That makes no sense." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "It wasn't that simple. When the deposit was discovered in 1962, the Cold War was at its height. The government wanted to avoid Soviet attention, so they classified the discovery and established a cover operation, a monitoring station disguised as an ordinary ranch, with our family as the caretakers." She set her mug down. "Our father, your grandfather, was already running this place. He agreed to the arrangement in exchange for financial security and the promise that the land would remain in Carson hands. So my entire family history is a government cover story?" James felt anger rising. "Everything I was taught about Carson legacy, about our connection to this land, it was all about guarding minerals?" "No," Eleanor said sharply. "The Carsons worked this land for generations before the discovery. The arrangement just complicated things." Her expression became distant. "For some of us more than others." "What happened between you and my father?" James asked. Why did he never mention you? Pain flickered across Eleanor's face. I was the geologist in the family. Richard was the rancher. When our father died, we disagreed about how to handle our responsibility. I wanted more government protection, more transparency about what we were guarding. Richard believed the fewer people who knew, the safer the secret would be. She looked down at her hands. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. I joined the USGS to monitor the situation from the inside. Richard stayed here, maintaining the cover. And my mother? Was she part of this arrangement? Eleanor's expression softened. Maria loved Richard for who he was, not for what he was protecting. Her death broke something in him. He became more isolated, more paranoid about the land. She met James's gaze. He was harder on you than he should have been. He was trying to prepare you without telling you the truth, and that's an impossible task. Before James could respond, his phone rang, Mike Donnelly's number flashing on the screen. James, we've got trouble, Mike said without preamble. Just got word that Meridian filed emergency permits with the county for exploratory drilling on properties surrounding Westridge. They're claiming watershed management under drought provisions, but the equipment they're bringing in is industrial grade. And there's something else, Thomas Reeves, that EPA guy? He's not EPA. Badge is fake. How do you know? Call the contact at the regional office. They've never heard of him. I'm heading your way now, but I'm at least 30 minutes out. Don't confront anyone who shows up. James ended the call and explained the situation to Eleanor. They're making their move, she said, rising quickly. With Richard gone, they think the ranch is vulnerable. She moved to the window, scanning the darkening landscape. How many people know about the cellar? Just me, as far as I know. And now you. Good. We need to secure those records before. Headlights swept across the yard as multiple vehicles approached from the main road. James moved to the front window. 3 black SUVs and what appeared to be a drilling truck were coming up the long drive. Is there a back way out? Eleanor asked, already gathering her things. Through the north pasture, James said, grabbing his father's journal and the contents from the safe deposit box. But we need what's in the cellar. They slipped out the back door and moved quickly across the yard. James unlocked the cellar door while Eleanor kept watch. Inside, they worked rapidly by flashlight, gathering the most critical documents and samples. There's too much to carry, James said, looking at the extensive records. Eleanor pulled a small device from her pocket and began taking rapid photographs of the maps and documents they couldn't take. Digital backup is better than nothing. As they finished, the sound of vehicles stopping in front of the house reached them. James peered through the small cellar window to see Catherine Voss emerging from the lead SUV, accompanied by Thomas Reeves and several men in work clothes. More concerning were the 2 security personnel with holstered weapons. We need to move, James whispered. They sealed the cellar, locked it, and made their way through shadows toward the equipment barn where James's truck was parked. They were halfway there when floodlights suddenly illuminated the yard, catching them in the harsh glare. Mr. Carson, Catherine's voice called out. We need to talk about those drilling permits. James pushed Eleanor toward the barn. Get to the truck. I'll stall them. He turned to face Catherine and her team, positioning himself to block their view of Eleanor moving toward the barn. You're trespassing. Again, he said loudly. Catherine approached, flanked by her security. Actually, we have county permits for water management on adjacent properties. We're merely here as a courtesy to inform you of work that might affect your water table. She smiled thinly. Your continued hostility is unnecessary. Permits obtained under false pretenses, James countered, noticing Thomas Reeves hanging back, watching him carefully. Your EPA man is an EPA. Something hardened in Catherine's expression. Mr. Carson, I don't think you understand the forces at work here. This isn't about a family ranch anymore. It's about national resource security. She gestured toward the men unloading equipment from the drilling truck. We're prepared to begin operations tonight on the Peterson property that borders your western line. We can do this the easy way, with your cooperation, or we can do it while managing complications. James heard his truck's engine turn over in the distance. Catherine's head snapped toward the sound. "Who else is here?" she demanded, signaling to her security team, who immediately drew their weapons. "That would be my aunt," James said, watching uncertainty flash across Catherine's face. "Dr. Eleanor Carson of the United States Geological Survey. I believe she outranks your fake EPA agent in terms of federal authority." The truck appeared from behind the barn, headlights off, moving fast across the pasture toward the north gate. One of the security men raised his weapon. "I wouldn't," James warned, his hand moving toward his waistband where his grandfather's revolver rested. "Firing on a federal employee would complicate your permits." Catherine raised a hand, stopping her man. "This changes nothing, Mr. Carson. The drilling proceeds tonight. Dr. Carson's presence only confirms what we already know. This isn't about ranching, it's about what's beneath the soil. And Meridian has the resources and political connections to extract it, with or without your cooperation." The truck disappeared into the darkness of the north pasture, bouncing over the uneven ground toward the county road that bordered Westridge Ranch. "You're right about one thing," James said, facing Catherine fully. "This isn't about ranching. It's about legacy and responsibility. And the Carsons have been protecting this land for a lot longer than Meridian has existed." Catherine's expression was cold in the harsh floodlights. "Protecting it for what? The minerals aren't doing anyone any good buried under a failing ranch. We're offering to extract resources vital to American security and technological advancement. While pocketing billions in profits," James added. "That's how business works, Mr. Carson. Now, are you going to cooperate, or will we need to proceed with more aggressive measures?" Before James could answer, the distant wail of a siren cut through the night. Sheriff Mike Donnelly's patrol car appeared on the main road, lights flashing as it sped toward the ranch. Catherine signaled to her team. "Pack it up. We'll continue this discussion through official channels." She turned back to James. "Consider your position carefully, Mr. Carson. By this time tomorrow, we'll be drilling whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you'll profit from it or become an obstacle to be removed." The threat hung in the air between them as Catherine and her team retreated to their vehicles. James watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness that had swallowed his aunt's escape. Mike's patrol car skidded to a stop in the yard. He jumped out, hand on his weapon. "You okay?" "I saw Meridian leaving." "For now," James said, the weight of his father's legacy settling more firmly on his shoulders. "But they'll be back. And next time, they're bringing drills." As the dust settled around them, James looked out over the darkened expanse of Westridge Ranch, land that had been in his family for generations, land that now represented something far beyond the cattle and crops he'd grown up resenting. His father had died protecting this place, this secret. Now that responsibility had passed to him, along with a family history far more complex than he'd ever imagined. The night wind carried the scent of sage and dust across the property, Carson land, with Carson's secrets buried deep beneath its surface. And for the first time since returning, James felt certain that he was exactly where he needed to be. Dawn broke over Westridge Ranch with a cold, uncertain light. James stood on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, watching two pickup trucks approach from the main road. Sheriff Mike Donnelly's patrol car followed close behind. The night had been long. After Meridian's departure, James had reconnected with Eleanor at the predetermined meeting point, an abandoned cattle shelter on the northern boundary. Together with Mike, they had formed a hasty plan while reviewing the documents they'd rescued from the cellar. Eleanor's truck pulled up first, dust billowing behind as she parked. She stepped out, followed by a gray-haired man carrying a worn leather briefcase. Mike's car and another pickup arrived simultaneously, disgorging Mike and two men James recognized as neighboring ranchers, Sam Wilson and Hal Peterson, whose families had worked adjacent land for generations. "I brought reinforcements," Eleanor called as she approached. "This is Robert Keller, my colleague from the USGS and an expert on mineral rights law. James shook hands with Keller, who had the weathered look of someone who'd spent more time in the field than in courtrooms despite his legal expertise. The cavalry, James observed, nodding toward Sam and Hal. Neighbors, Mike corrected. Word travels fast. Especially when Meridian's drilling equipment starts moving in the middle of the night. Hal Peterson, 70 years old with a face like sun-hardened leather, spat on the ground. My daddy and your granddaddy fought the banks together in '47. Carsons and Petersons don't always see eye to eye, but we stand together when outsiders come sniffing. Sam Wilson, younger but no less determined, nodded in agreement. Meridian's been pressuring everyone. Bought the Johnson place last month, the Davis homestead before that. They're surrounding us. Inside, around the kitchen table that had hosted 4 generations of Carson family meals, they spread out maps, documents, and legal papers. Robert Keller examined the geological surveys with growing excitement. These estimates are conservative, he said, tapping the papers. Based on modern extraction methods, what's here could be worth upwards of $3 billion. Maybe more. Which is why Meridian's offering millions for land that's supposedly worthless, Eleanor added. Can they really start drilling today? James asked, pouring more coffee for everyone. Mike shook his head. I've challenged their permits on procedural grounds. That buys us maybe 48 hours before the county commissioner overrules me. He's in Meridian's pocket. And they'll come harder next time, Sam warned. These corporate types don't take rejection well. Robert Keller cleared his throat. There's another angle we haven't discussed. The original government classification in 1962 was never properly declassified. The paperwork Eleanor found shows the reclassification 3 years ago was procedurally flawed. He looked at James. Legally speaking, this deposit might still fall under federal protection, which would invalidate any county permits. But that would mean surrendering control to the government, James said, understanding dawning. The very thing my father fought against his entire life. Eleanor's eyes met his, a shared understanding passing between them, the first moment of true family connection. Richard believed Carson's stewardship was better than government bureaucracy or corporate greed. He wasn't wrong. What about the trust? James asked. The will said the 3 trustees had to approve any sale. Which gives us leverage, Eleanor confirmed. But we need time to file the proper legal challenges. We need more than time, Hal interjected, his weathered hands flat on the table. We need to catch them red-handed. Prove they're not after water but minerals. A plan began to form, one that required coordination, trust, and the kind of neighbor-to-neighbor cooperation that had sustained these ranching communities through drought, economic hardship, and corporate incursions for generations. By midday, pickup trucks from 6 neighboring ranches had arrived, carrying men and women armed with determination and a deep understanding of the land. They gathered in the barn, away from potential surveillance, where James, Eleanor, and Mike outlined their strategy. They'll come tonight, James explained. Their permits, fake as they are, give them access to the Peterson land that borders our western fence line. The geological surveys show they can potentially reach the mineral deposit from there, though it would require deep, angled drilling. We need evidence of their real intentions, Eleanor added. If they're officially testing for water but actually taking mineral core samples, we've got them on permit violations and potential federal security breaches. Which is why we need eyes on their operation, Mike finished. But it has to be legal. No trespassing, no interference. Just documentation. Sam Wilson grinned. Good thing the Peterson North Ridge has the best view of that drill site. And good thing it's calving season, so we've got legitimate reasons to be up there all night with cameras. Hal nodded. And my water rights give me access to test the creek that runs between our properties. The one that would be affected by their drilling. The community mobilized with the quiet efficiency that comes from generations of helping each other through emergencies. Communication plans were established, positions assigned, equipment gathered. What had begun as James's solitary return to a place he'd once fled had transformed into a community standing together against an outside threat. As everyone dispersed to their assignments, Eleanor lingered behind. In the fading afternoon light, she resembled Richard Carson so strongly that James felt a momentary disorientation, as if his father's ghost had manifested to witness this defense of Carson land. "There's something you should know," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "The sealed addendum to the will. I know what it contains." James leaned against a fence post, waiting. "Richard established a conservation trust. If we successfully protect the ranch and the minerals, the proceeds from any limited, controlled extraction go into a foundation for sustainable water management throughout the valley." He wanted this discovery to benefit everyone, not just the Carson family. James wasn't surprised. Somehow, it made perfect sense. His father's rigid commitment to the land had never been about personal enrichment. The trust, the secrecy, the responsibility he'd tried to instill in his son, it had all been aimed at something larger than family legacy. "He should have told me," James said, the old anger flickering briefly. "All those years, he could have explained." "He was sworn to secrecy," Eleanor replied. "We both were. The difference was, I left. He stayed, carrying the burden alone." Her eyes, so like his own, held decades of regret. "After your mother died, I tried to reconnect, to help with you. Richard wouldn't allow it. He believed isolation was safer, fewer people to slip up, fewer connections that could be leveraged against him." The setting sun cast long shadows across land that had been in Carson hands for generations, land that contained not just their family history but a resource that could reshape the economic future of the entire region. James tried to imagine his father's decades of solitary guardianship, the weight of secrets kept from everyone, including his only son. "What would he want us to do now?" James asked. Eleanor smiled sadly. "He already told you. That's why you're here." Night fell across Westridge Ranch with unusual clarity, stars emerging in brilliant clusters above land that had witnessed a century of Carson struggles, triumphs, and sacrifices. James positioned himself on the ridge overlooking the western boundary, where Meridian's drilling equipment had been assembled throughout the afternoon. Beside him, Mike Donnelly scanned the area with night vision binoculars. "They're right on schedule," Mike murmured, passing the binoculars to James. Below, floodlights illuminated a drilling platform erected with remarkable speed. Trucks and equipment had been arriving throughout the day, establishing a significant operation that far exceeded what would be necessary for water testing. Catherine Voss's SUV was parked near a temporary command center, where she could be seen issuing directions to the team. 8 men on the drilling platform, James noted. For security personnel. Equipment consistent with mineral extraction, not water sampling. Mike nodded. Sam and Hal are documenting from the north. Eleanor and Keller are with the USGS team at the creek access point. Everyone's in position. Their phones buzzed simultaneously, a message from Eleanor, core sampling equipment confirmed. Definitely not water testing. USGS witnesses on site. That's it, Mike said. Permit violation at minimum. Possible federal resource security breach at worst. James watched as the drilling operation began, powerful equipment biting into earth that had been Carson land since before his grandfather was born. Something tightened in his chest, not just anger at the invasion, but a deeper connection to the soil itself, to the legacy his father had protected so fiercely. "I need to get closer," he decided. "The creek gives me legal access to document the runoff." Mike looked doubtful but didn't argue. "Be careful. Their security doesn't look like the type to ask questions first." James moved quietly through familiar terrain, land he'd explored as a boy, resented as a teenager, and fled as a young man. Now, he navigated by instinct and memory, making his way to the creek bed that marked the property boundary. From there, he could document the drilling operation from barely 50 yards away, close enough to capture crucial details. The drilling platform vibrated with power as the bit descended, deeper and at a sharper angle than any water test would require. James photographed everything: the equipment specifications, the core sample collection, the technicians consulting maps that clearly showed geological formations, not water tables. He was so focused on documentation that he didn't notice the security guard until the flashlight beam caught him directly. "You're trespassing," the guard called, hand moving to his weapon. "Creek access," James replied calmly, holding up water testing equipment Eleanor had provided. "Legal right to monitor water quality affected by your operation." The guard hesitated, then spoke into his radio. Moments later, Catherine Voss emerged from the command center, approaching the creek boundary with measured steps. "Mr. Carson," she called, her voice carrying over the mechanical drone of the drill. "This is becoming harassment." "Just protecting my interests," James replied, continuing to photograph the operation. "Interesting equipment choices for water testing." Catherine's professional mask slipped, revealing the calculated ambition beneath. "We both know what this is about. The question is whether you're going to be reasonable or force us to take more aggressive measures." "Like what happened to my father?" James asked, watching her reaction carefully. Something flickered in her expression, not guilt, but wariness. "Heart attacks happen, Mr. Carson. Especially to stubborn men who refuse medical advice. And the fake EPA agent? The rushed permits? The security teams with military backgrounds? All coincidences?" Catherine stepped closer to the creek boundary. "The minerals beneath this valley are going to be extracted. That's not negotiable. The only variable is who benefits." She lowered her voice. "Meridian's offer still stands, $15 million. Sign today, we handle the trust complications, and you never have to see this place again." "That's not going to happen." Her smile was cold in the harsh floodlights. "Then I hope you've made peace with what comes next. Some accidents are unavoidable on working ranches. Especially for owners who lack experience." The threat hung between them, as tangible as the dirt beneath their feet. Before James could respond, lights appeared on the ridge above, vehicles moving into position, surrounding the drilling site. "Carson!" Hal Peterson's voice boomed through a megaphone. "You've got company." Catherine's head snapped up as additional lights appeared, trucks from neighboring ranches positioning themselves on legal vantage points around the operation. At the main road entrance, a convoy of government vehicles with USGS markings pulled into view, Eleanor and Robert Keller in the lead vehicle. "What is this?" Catherine demanded. James smiled. "Community oversight. Turns out my neighbors take water quality very seriously. And those federal agents? They're very interested in unauthorized mineral sampling in a potentially classified zone." The drilling operation froze as Eleanor approached the site with 4 USGS colleagues. She presented documents to the security team, who had no choice but to allow the inspection. Catherine retreated to make urgent phone calls, her carefully constructed plan visibly unraveling. Within an hour, the drilling had been officially halted pending federal review. Catherine Voss departed after a heated exchange with her superiors, leaving the technical team to secure the site under USGS supervision. As dawn approached, neighbors gathered at the Westridge Ranch house, the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and the quiet satisfaction of a community that had successfully defended one of its own. "It's temporary," Robert Keller cautioned as they reviewed the night's events. "Meridian has powerful connections. They'll challenge the classification status, pressure the right officials. But we've established a legal foothold," Eleanor added. "And documented their permit violations. That gives us time to properly file the trust provisions and conservation framework Richard established." James sat at the head of the kitchen table, his father's place, surrounded by neighbors who had rallied despite decades of his absence, family he hadn't known existed, and a legacy deeper than he had ever understood. "What happens next?" Sam Wilson asked, voicing the question everyone was considering. "If the minerals are worth billions, this fight's just beginning." "We established the Conservation Trust," James said with newfound certainty. "The one my father planned. Limited extraction under local control, with proceeds benefiting the entire valley's water management and economic development." He looked around the table. Carson land serving Carson values, community, sustainability, independence. Eleanor's eyes shone with something between pride and vindication. Richard would approve. Richard was a stubborn old goat, Hal Peterson grumbled good-naturedly. But he understood what mattered. Land isn't just dirt, it's a trust we hold for those who come after us. As the neighbors departed and morning light spread across the ranch, James walked with Eleanor to the family cemetery. They stood in silence before Richard Carson's fresh grave, two people connected by blood and shared purpose despite decades of separation. "Will you stay?" Eleanor finally asked. The trust needs a Carson on the land. James considered the question that had defined his relationship with Westridge Ranch's entire life: stay or go, accept the burden or flee the responsibility. For 20 years, he'd chosen distance, building a life deliberately disconnected from this place and its demands. "I don't know if I can be what he was," James admitted. The ranch was his life. "It doesn't have to be yours," Eleanor said. "Not in the same way. Times change. Responsibilities evolve." She gestured toward the valley below, where neighboring ranches spread across the landscape. What Richard protected wasn't just minerals or water, it was a way of life. Community. Independence. The right to determine our own futures. Later that day, James found himself in his father's study, the afternoon sun casting familiar patterns through windows that had witnessed 4 generations of Carson decisions. On the desk lay the sealed addendum to the will, finally opened in the presence of all 3 trustees. The document outlined Richard Carson's vision in remarkable detail: a conservation and economic development trust that would manage the mineral resources for the benefit of the entire valley, ensuring water security, sustainable agriculture, and community control over extraction. James ran his fingers over his father's signature, recognizing the weight of legacy not as a burden but as a connection, to the past, to the land, to a future his father had spent a lifetime protecting. The man who had seemed so rigid, so unyielding, had been planning for generations beyond his own, beyond even his son's. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mike Donnelly stood in the doorway, holding a small package. "Found this in your father's truck," Mike said, handing over a worn envelope. It was tucked under the seat. "Has your name on it." Alone again, James opened the envelope. Inside was a single key and a handwritten note in his father's distinctive script: "James, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've chosen to stay. The key opens the strongbox in the workshop, your grandfather's journals, your mother's letters, the history I should have shared but couldn't. The land has its demands, but it gives back what matters: roots, purpose, connection. I failed to show you that. Perhaps now you'll discover it on your own terms." Dad, the workshop stood unchanged since James's childhood, tools arranged with military precision, the smell of oil and leather pervading the space where Richard Carson had maintained the equipment that kept Westridge Ranch functioning. The strongbox was where it had always been, hidden beneath the workbench, forbidden to curious children. The key turned smoothly. Inside lay family history more personal than mineral rights or government secrets: his mother's letters detailing her love for the difficult, principled man she had married, his grandfather's journals chronicling decades of ranching challenges, photographs James had never seen of his father as a young man, smiling beside a red-haired woman who could only be Eleanor. Beneath these treasures lay a final envelope containing recent photographs: James's college graduation, which his father had claimed to be too busy to attend, newspaper clippings about James's career, a father's secret record of a son's life lived far from home. As evening settled across Westridge Ranch, James sat on the porch, watching distant thunderheads build over mountains that had witnessed the entire Carson story. Eleanor joined him, 2 coffee mugs in hand. "I found his records," James said quietly. "He kept track of my life, even when I thought he didn't care." Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Richard was better at loving from a distance. Protecting was easier than connecting. She handed him a mug. "The trust paperwork is filed. Robert's team is coordinating with federal agencies on classification review. We've bought time, maybe more." "What would you have done?" James asked. If you'd inherited instead of me, would you have stayed? His aunt's gaze swept across the land that had divided her from her brother for decades. I made my peace with this place long ago. The question is whether you have. In the distance, lights appeared on the county road, more neighbors arriving for the impromptu strategy session that had been called to coordinate the valley's response to Meridian's inevitable countermoves. Community forming around common purpose, shared history, mutual defense. I used to think he loved this land more than anything, James said. More than me. Eleanor shook her head. He protected the land because of you, not instead of you. Legacy isn't about the past, James. It's about the future. As neighbors' trucks pulled into the yard, James stood, feeling the weight of Carson responsibility settling onto shoulders that had once shrugged it off. The minerals beneath would still be there tomorrow, and Meridian would return with new tactics, new pressures, new threats. The fight to protect what Richard Carson had guarded would continue. But for the first time since returning to Westridge Ranch, James felt something his father had tried and failed to instill in him as a child: connection to something larger than himself, a purpose rooted in soil that had nourished and challenged his family for generations. Not obligation, but belonging. The son who had fled his father's unyielding expectations now stood on the porch of a home he had inherited twice, once through legal documents that transferred property, and again through understanding that transformed burden into legacy. The land remained, as it always had, indifferent to human drama, yet somehow central to the human story unfolding upon it. And somewhere, beneath the surface of Carson soil, secrets remained, minerals and memories, possibilities and responsibilities, waiting to be uncovered by those who understood their true value. Not as commodities to be exploited, but as resources to be shepherded for generations yet to come. As the first neighbors reached the porch, James welcomed them as his father would have, as stewards of a shared valley, protectors of a common future, guardians of something more precious than minerals or money, the right to determine their own destiny on land that remembered every promise, every sacrifice, every Carson who had ever called it home. 6 months passed with the steady rhythm of seasons that had governed Westridge Ranch for generations. Winter surrendered to spring, bringing new calves to the pastures and the first tentative grain to fields that had suffered through years of drought. Nature continued its ancient cycles while human conflicts played out across the weathered landscape. The battle with Meridian Agricultural evolved from confrontation to legal warfare, cease and desist orders, federal reviews, emergency injunctions filed and contested in courtrooms far from the soil they concerned. Catherine Voss had been replaced by a team of corporate attorneys who lacked her personal vendetta but compensated with procedural expertise and seemingly limitless resources. Yet something unexpected had emerged alongside the conflict. The Carson Conservation Trust, established through Richard's foresight and Eleanor's expertise, had gained national attention. Environmental organizations, sustainable resource advocates, and community development foundations had rallied behind the model it proposed: responsible mineral extraction controlled by local stakeholders, with profits directed toward water security and economic resilience for the entire valley. James stood on the ridge overlooking the western boundary, watching the sunrise illuminate land that had been in his family for over a century. The drilling equipment had been removed months ago, leaving only the faint scars of temporary roads across Peterson land. Beside him, Mike Donnelly sipped coffee from a thermos. "Federal classification review comes back today," Mike said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Robert Keller called from Washington last night." James nodded, eyes still on the distant mountains. "Eleanor thinks it'll go our way. The paperwork trail is clear: improper declassification procedures, failure to notify stakeholders. And if it doesn't? Then we fight the next battle." James had developed his father's quiet determination, though without the isolation that had made Richard Carson such a solitary figure. The trust framework is solid regardless. Meridian can't force a sale without trustee approval. Mike surveyed the ranch spreading below them, cattle grazing in the east pasture, the old barns freshly painted, new irrigation equipment glinting in the early light. "Place looks different. Better." It was true. The past months had seen Westridge Ranch transformed, not into a modern industrial operation, but into a working demonstration of sustainable ranching practices. The infusion of initial funding from conservation partners had enabled critical infrastructure improvements while maintaining the essential character of Carson land. Community investment does that, James said. 17 families own shares in the water management system now. Their futures are tied to this place just like mine. This had been Eleanor's most significant contribution, restructuring the trust to include neighboring ranches in a cooperative water rights agreement that protected everyone from both drought and corporate acquisition. The minerals remained under Carson land, but the benefits would flow throughout the valley when extraction eventually began. They drove back to the ranch house as morning light strengthened across the landscape. 3 trucks were already parked in the yard: Sam Wilson's mud-spattered Ford, Hal Peterson's ancient Chevy, and Eleanor's government vehicle. The kitchen windows glowed with warm light against the dawn chill. Inside, Eleanor sat at the head of the table, the position James had insisted she take in acknowledgement of her expertise and family seniority. She was reviewing documents with Sam and Hal, all 3 looking up as James and Mike entered. "Robert called," she said without preamble. "Classification review is complete. The decision maintains federal protection of the mineral deposits under national security provisions, with local development rights assigned to the Carson Conservation Trust." Her face broke into a rare, full smile. "Meridian's permits are permanently invalidated. They can participate as a contractor if we approve, but they can't force development or acquisition." The kitchen erupted in congratulatory exclamations and backslapping. Even Hal Peterson, who rarely displayed emotion beyond gruff disapproval, allowed a brief grin to cross his weathered face. "Richard would be pleased," he said quietly to James. "He fought this battle his whole life. Never thought it would end in our favor." "It hasn't ended," James replied, pouring coffee for everyone. "It's just changed." After the initial celebration subsided, they settled into the practical matters that had become their regular routine: irrigation scheduling for the cooperative system, cattle rotation plans, updates on the trust's legal status. The kitchen that had once witnessed Richard Carson's solitary breakfasts now served as command center for a community reclaiming control of its future. When the meeting concluded, Eleanor lingered behind as the others departed. James recognized the expression on her face, the same look his father had worn when preparing to discuss difficult truths. "The mineral extraction framework is finalized," she said, sliding a document across the table. "Limited, controlled development beginning next spring. Environmental safeguards beyond federal requirements. Local hiring mandates. Profit distribution according to Richard's specifications, 65% to water infrastructure and sustainable agriculture development, 20% to community education and healthcare, 15% to Carson family maintenance of the trust lands." James reviewed the document, recognizing the culmination of months of work by Eleanor and the legal team she had assembled. "It's what he wanted. What you both wanted. There's something else." Eleanor hesitated, reaching into her briefcase for another folder. The medical examiner finally released the full toxicology report on Richard's death. James felt his chest tighten. "And? Traces of digoxin in his system. Not enough to be conclusive, but unusual for someone not prescribed heart medication." She met his eyes directly. "The findings are inconclusive, but suggestive." "Meridian," James said quietly. "We can't prove it. Catherine Voss visited him 3 days before his death. Brought coffee, according to his journal." Eleanor's expression hardened. "The federal investigation is ongoing." James absorbed this information with the calm that had gradually replaced his initial anger upon returning to Westridge. He died protecting this place. Making sure it would pass to the right hands. "He believed you would come back when it mattered," Eleanor confirmed. "Even when you thought you'd left for good." After Eleanor departed for her meetings in Washington, James walked the property alone, following paths his father had traveled daily for decades. The land felt different beneath his feet now, not the prison of his youth or the burden of his inheritance, but something he was part of, a living history he was continuing rather than escaping. Near the old creek bed where he'd learned to fish as a child, James paused to watch water flowing clear and strong, the result of the cooperative watershed management program that now extended throughout the valley. The drought had eased, though long-term climate challenges remained. The difference was that the community now faced them together, rather than as isolated operations vulnerable to corporate acquisition during hard times. His phone rang, Robert Keller calling with updates from Washington. "It's official," Robert announced without preamble. "The mineral rights framework is approved. The Carson Conservation Trust has full development authority, with government oversight but no control. And there's more, Meridian's parent company is under federal investigation for attempted mineral rights fraud across 3 states. Their stock dropped 30% this morning. And Catherine Voss? Resigned 3 weeks ago. Disappeared from public view. The investigation is expanding to include potential criminal charges related to several suspicious deaths of landowners who refused to sell." James thanked him and ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he continued walking. Justice moved slowly, but it moved. His father would have appreciated that, the steady, inexorable force of truth emerging like groundwater finding its way to the surface. At the family cemetery, James stopped before his father's grave. The headstone was simple, Richard Michael Carson, with dates and the words he protected what mattered. James had chosen the epitaph, understanding at last what his father had dedicated his life to preserving. "You were right," he said quietly to the stone. "I came back when it mattered." The Autumn Harvest Festival brought the entire valley together at Westridge Ranch for the first time in decades. Tables stretched across the yard, laden with food prepared by families who had worked this land for generations. Children played where cattle usually grazed, their laughter carrying across fields that had witnessed years of isolation and suspicion. Eleanor returned from Washington for the occasion, bringing official documentation of the trust's final approval. As the sun began to set, James called for everyone's attention, standing on the porch where his father had kept solitary vigil for so many years. "My father wasn't an easy man," he began, his voice carrying across the gathered community. "Most of you knew him better than I did, in some ways. He kept to himself, held his secrets close. For years, I thought that was his weakness, his inability to connect, to trust, to build community." James surveyed the faces looking back at him, neighbors who had rallied when needed, extended family he was still getting to know, partners in a cooperative venture that would sustain the valley for generations. "What I've learned since coming home is that isolation wasn't his nature, it was his burden. The responsibility he carried wasn't just about protecting land or minerals or water rights. It was about preserving the possibility of this moment, all of us standing together, determining our own future." He gestured toward Eleanor, who joined him on the porch with the trust documents. "Today, we're officially establishing what my father envisioned and my aunt helped create, a framework that ensures this valley's resources benefit the people who work its soil, the communities that have sustained it through generations of hardship and harvest." Eleanor unfolded the document, her voice steady as she read the key provisions: sustainable extraction practices, local economic development, water security, educational opportunities for future generations. The legal language couldn't capture the deeper meaning of what they had accomplished, not just resource protection, but the rebirth of community self-determination in an age of corporate consolidation. As evening deepened into night, lanterns illuminated the gathering. Hal Peterson, who rarely spoke at length, stood to offer a toast. "To Richard Carson," he said, raising his glass. "Stubborn as a mule and twice as ornery. But he understood something worth remembering: land isn't just something you own. It's something you belong to." Hal's gaze swept across the gathered faces. Into James, who came home to finish what his father started. Music and conversation continued late into the night, a community celebration unlike anything Westridge Ranch had hosted in living memory. As families eventually departed for their own homes, James stood on the porch watching taillights disappear down the long driveway. Eleanor joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the autumn chill. "Richard would have hated all the fuss," she observed with a small smile. "But he would have appreciated the outcome." "I used to think he was afraid of change," James said. Now I understand he was protecting the possibility of the right kind of change, the kind that preserves what matters while allowing for growth. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, Eleanor replied. It's what continues through you. A year passed. The first phase of mineral extraction began with careful environmental monitoring and local hiring preferences. The operation was nothing like what Meridian had planned: smaller, slower, more sustainable, with benefits flowing to the community rather than distant shareholders. Spring brought news that the federal investigation into Catherine Voss had resulted in indictments for fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to criminal negligence resulting in death. The evidence wasn't conclusive enough for murder charges, but justice was finding its path, however winding. On the anniversary of his return to Westridge Ranch, James sat in his father's study, now his own, reviewing the trust's quarterly reports. The economic impact was already visible throughout the valley: modernized irrigation systems, improved school facilities, healthcare access, sustainable agriculture initiatives. The minerals beneath Carson land were finally serving their purpose, not through exploitation but through careful stewardship. A knock at the door interrupted his work. Mike Donnelly entered, holding a small package. "This came for you," Mike said, handing over a plain envelope with no return address. "Hand-delivered to the sheriff's office this morning." Inside, James found a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Mr. Carson, these are the original files documenting Meridian's operations across 5 states, including their targeted acquisition of properties with mineral deposits and their methods for removing obstacles. I was complicit in activities I once justified as business necessity. The approaching consequences have clarified my perspective on what matters. Your father refused our final offer the day before his death. He said Carson land would never be sold while he lived. I didn't order what happened next, but I suspected and remained silent. This evidence may help complete the investigation. Some debts can't be repaid." K. Voss. James handed the note to Mike, who read it with widening eyes. "Confession?" Mike asked. "As close as we'll get," James replied. "Forward it to the federal investigators. Let justice take its course." After Mike left, James walked to the window overlooking land that had been transformed over the past 18 months, not just physically with improved infrastructure and sustainable practices, but spiritually as the center of a community finding its way forward together. The minerals beneath the surface would provide for generations, but James had come to understand they weren't the true treasure his father had protected. The real legacy was the continuation of a way of life, independent but interconnected, rooted in land that remembered every sacrifice, every struggle, every decision that had led to this moment. Eleanor had returned to her USGS position in Washington but visited monthly, her expertise guiding the trust's development while their family relationship deepened beyond professional collaboration. The Carson siblings' legacy continued through their respective contributions, Richard's unwavering protection and Eleanor's scientific vision combining in ways neither could have accomplished alone. Summer came with generous rainfall that replenished aquifers and nourished crops throughout the valley. On a warm evening, James hosted a small gathering on the porch, Eleanor visiting from Washington, Mike and his wife, Hal Peterson and Sam Wilson with their families. The conversation flowed easily among people connected by land, purpose, and shared history. As twilight settled across the fields, Eleanor raised her glass. "To absent family," she said quietly. "To those who kept the trust," James added, thinking of his father's decades of solitary vigilance. Later, as the gathering dispersed and night descended fully on Westridge Ranch, James walked alone to the ridge overlooking the western boundary. The lights of neighboring ranches dotted the darkness, small constellations marking human presence on land that had witnessed centuries of struggle, adaptation, and perseverance. The minerals that had drawn corporate predators and caused decades of secrecy were finally serving their intended purpose, not enriching distant shareholders but strengthening the community that had always been their rightful beneficiary. The Carson Conservation Trust was becoming a model studied by communities throughout the West facing similar pressures from resource extraction companies. James thought about the journey that had brought him back to land he'd once fled, the anger that had driven him away, the duty that had drawn him back, and the understanding that had led him to stay. His father's rigid commitment had protected possibilities James couldn't have imagined as a resentful young man desperate for escape. The night wind carried the scent of sage and rain-dampened earth, the smell of home, of continuity, of belonging. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called and was answered by another, their voices echoing across Carson land that would remain under family stewardship for generations to come. The son who had once rejected his inheritance now embraced a legacy larger than property, a commitment to stewardship that extended beyond family to community, beyond present to future. The burden his father had carried alone was now shared among many hands, making it lighter without diminishing its significance. As James turned back toward the house, lights glowing in windows that had witnessed a century of Carson triumphs and struggles, he felt his father's presence not as a ghost but as a continuation. The land remembered every Carson who had worked its soil, protected its secrets, preserved its possibilities. And in that remembering, nothing was truly lost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, climate change, economic pressures, political complications, but the framework his father had envisioned and he had helped establish would weather these storms as Carson land had always weathered adversity, with stubborn resilience, quiet adaptation, and unshakable commitment to values deeper than profit. The minerals would eventually be depleted, but the trust would endure. The water would continue flowing through cooperative management systems that protected everyone's interests. The community would remain interconnected through shared purpose and mutual support. This was the true wealth beneath the surface of Westridge Ranch, not rare earth elements or precious metals, but the understanding that some things belong not to individuals but to generations, that legacy isn't possession but continuation, that the most valuable resources aren't extracted but nurtured. James Carson, once the reluctant heir, now the willing steward, walked back to the house his family had built, maintained, and preserved through war, depression, drought, and corporate threat. The burden had become purpose. The inheritance had become gift. The past had become prologue. The land endured, as it always had, bearing witness to the human drama that unfolded upon it, remembering every sacrifice, every mistake, every act of courage or cowardice. And in that memory, carried in soil and stone, water and wind, lay the true legacy of Carson land, not what was taken from it, but what it continued to give. Not ownership, but belonging. Not extraction, but continuation. Not the end of a story, but its endless telling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.